Welcome to According to Sam, folks. This is episode 181, and thank you for watching. Folks, we're going to get into talking about the Sumerians and back into the Mesopotamian history that we started talking about in the last podcast. I was really on the verge of changing everything up and talking about a totally different issue in this podcast because of a documentary that I watched yesterday and an interview that Tucker Carlson did yesterday with Brent Weinstein. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that topic in the start of this podcast, and then we're going to get into the black-headed ones. And the black-headed ones, you'll see who they are when we get to that, the Sumerians. I want to start by playing this clip. This was Taylor Lorenz. Now, this was a video that went viral. You probably have already seen it, but a video that went viral last week of her in this frantic meltdown because the LA Times ended up laying off their entire team of journalists. Print media is dying, and there's only a few major print outlets that are surviving in this new media landscape. And I want you to listen, if you haven't seen this video of Taylor Lorenz lamenting the fact that the fake news is dying. That's what happens when you are fake news. You're dying because you don't have any integrity. But listen to Taylor Lorenz. If you don't know who Taylor Lorenz is, she works for the Washington Post. The Washington Post is also thriving again. It's owned by Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men in the world. And this goes back to Hearst and the way that, rich people have always owned media, even if it turns a profit or not. I don't know that the Washington Post is turning the profit, but even if it doesn't, Jeff Bezos has the funds to keep the Washington Post afloat. So the Washington Post, New York Times has, made moves to diversify their revenue streams so they're able to stay afloat. And there are few of the small markets, but print media is dying. The fake news is dying. And it's not only print media. The viewership of the fake news on these television networks is down significantly. People are listening to podcasts, people that they can trust, or people they can at least trust to be honest with them, even if they're not right all the time. You know that they're not intentionally deceiving you, and that's what people are turning to as consumers. This is just a consumer marketplace. So listen to Taylor Lorenz.
The journalism industry is basically in a free fall. Today, the Los Angeles Times laid off 115 employees. They wiped out their entire DC bureau in an election year. They laid off pretty much all of their sports teams. They killed their entire tech and business section. They laid off breaking news writers, social media editors. The list goes on. But what's really dark is this is just the latest in months and months and months of layoffs in the media industry. In fact, tens of thousands of journalists have been laid off in the past year. Major media companies.
So I don't have time to go into all of this. You get the point. The fake news is dying, and this is because consumers don't want to consume fake news. I have much better things to do with my time than consume fake news. Well, this is the documentary that I watched over the last couple of actually watched it yesterday. A friend sent it to me the day before yesterday. Actually watched it. I watched this documentary the day before yesterday, actually. On Wednesday is when I watched this. And then Tucker Carlson did the interview Brett Weinstein yesterday, which just reinforced everything that's in this documentary. This documentary is about two journalists, two real journalists who took a plane down to Ecuador. They started in Ecuador, then they went to Colombia, then they made the entire trek up the Darien in Colombia, the Darien jungle in Colombia. This is journalism right here, Taylor Lorenz. One of the comments underneath this video says that in a just world, you guys would get a Pulitzer. I mean, in a just world, these guys would get a Pulitzer. And this is what I was tempted to change course and talk about what these guys do on this trek and what they show. It is, I mean, this is mind blowing. But none of Taylor Lorenz's, journalists from the LA Times or any of these dying fake news outlets, they don't have the resources to do what these YouTubers did and took their cameras down into the Darien Gap and showed what's happening. And what's happening, people, is absolutely astonishing. I was blown away by this hour expose that these two YouTubers on Muckracker, I mean, they put themselves in danger, real danger. I mean, if this was a just world, these guys would get a Pulitzer for this. This is journalism. And this is what we don't have in this country, what these guys did. And what they uncovered is mind-blowing. And maybe we'll pick this up on Monday and talk about this. And then you had the Brett Weinstein interview that I was telling you about with Tucker Carlson yesterday. And he just reinforced everything that's in that documentary. He went down there and he's just blown away. You got to look at some basics, a little bit of this.
I do have to ask something of your audience. There's part of this that is just me reporting what I saw and what I learned from Michael and others on our trip. And there's part of it that's me speculating, and I'm trying to do it as responsibly as possible because a great deal hinges on what the actual explanation for what we looked at is. So when I'm speculating, I'm going to be careful to tell you that that's what I'm doing, and people should, treat hypotheses as hypotheses and nothing more. But the first place that this trip really changed my understanding was I went down thinking that I was going to see a migration. And other people have called it an invasion. And there's something troubling to me about the tension between these two things. I mean, which is it? And I came away with the sense that it's probably literally both. And the way that manifests is you have a massive movement of people through the Darien from Colombia. Now, I did not know when I went down. I now know that most of those people actually start in Ecuador.
In Ecuador.
And the reason they start in Ecuador is that Ecuador has a policy where they don't require a visa. So people coming from all over the world can land in Quito, Ecuador.
And then they go from Ecuador to Colombia. So Brett Weinstein goes down to Panama on his own investigation. This guy's a biologist. Goes down there and does his own, he wants to see what's going on. The other two guys with the Mudracker, they're journalists. They went down there to report a story and they made the entire track from Ecuador. They start in Ecuador and they reinforce everything that Brett Weinstein says in this interview with Tucker Carlson that he experienced when he went down there, that they start in Ecuador, they go to Colombia, from Colombia, they go to the Darien by 3 different routes. Oh my God, people, you have no idea what we are up against. And both Weinstein and in this Muckracker documentary, they talk about how the Chinese are coming, the Chinese are here, and they're so people, and it's not only that, it's the NGOs and Catholic charities and the UN. They're facilitating it the whole way through. They know that women are getting raped. They know that people are being robbed and murdered. The guys in that documentary call it the Trail of Tears, is what they call it. The Trail of Tears is what they call it. They know people are suffering through this trek, and they are facilitating it. The NGOs, the non-governmental groups that are getting governmental money from the Biden administration. People. I shouldn't have even started with this because I could do the whole show on this, and I wanted to so bad, but let's start talking about the dark-headed ones. And the dark-headed ones are the Sumerian people. They called themselves the dark-headed ones. Sag-Gaiga is their language, and that means dark-headed ones. And it doesn't mean that they were black or that they were dark themselves. I'm pretty sure that they were dark-skinned. They probably look very much like the people who live in that area now. You think about like Saddam Hussein. He had dark hair, and says that it is believed that this term originated due to the contrast between the dark hair color of the Sumerians and the lighter hair color of the neighboring people. So we're going to start talking about them. I want to just, take us back to what we started talking about in the last podcast. We were talking about the Anunnaki. We were talking about their gods, Enlil, Enki, Anu, Ki. And those are four. Again, their pantheon had almost 4,000 gods. They continue adding gods. And, what I'm going to tell you, we're going to talk about their culture. And what I'm going to tell you about Sumerian culture today, it also is going to be consistent with the base culture of the way the Sumerians lived is the base, cultural, structural, societal, structural that the Akkadians had, that the Babylonians had, that the Assyrians had. So when we talk about the caste system, what the levels of the caste are, they're going to change at the higher levels, because in the beginning of the Sumerian Empire, there is the priest is the highest of the caste, and then it changes as the kings start to come about. But you're going to see here in a moment that when the Sumerian people started their cities and their city-states, that they were essentially a democracy. They had a council that they would vote for at the top, but and this is very important, that the head of the hierarchy, the person that's at the top, was the priest. And then again, when the kings start coming about, the power of the priest doesn't diminish. The kings and the priests kind of share power. Sometimes the king is the priest. We're gonna talk about a character in the Hebrew Bible, Melchizedek, who was a king and a priest. So that could be the case. And then when the kings come about, they begin to even deify themselves, add themselves to the pantheon. So they're not only continuing to add gods to the pantheon. Sometimes a king would add himself to the pantheon and say that now I am a god. So, how do we know what we know about the Sumerian people? This is what the city of Uruk could have looked like during the height of the Sumerian nation. You would see the temple here in the center of the city. You'll see the obelisk, because like I told you, the obelisk did not originate in Egypt. It predates Egypt. These people were sun worshipers, just like the Egyptians were. The very earliest man were sun worship. So in the last podcast, we talked about the gods a little bit, but in this podcast, we're going to talk about the people. But I want to clarify a couple of things. In the last podcast, I think I mistakenly said that the beginning of the Sumerian empire, or they weren't an empire, the Sumerian nation, that the time that preceded the beginning of their nation would have been the times of Noah. And I think I said that the times of Noah would have been the Neolithic, late Stone Age, and that's completely not true. If the times of Noah, if the flood that the Sumerians talk about in their text, and in the text, the Hebrew text, if that flood happened, it would have happened more than 1,000 years before the Sumerian nation. It would have been Paleolithic, not Neolithic. So I wanted to clarify that. And we also know that there was an ice age around that time. And we know that the Bering Strait here was frozen over during that ice age. And people migrated from Asia over the Bering Strait into the Americas. And that's why you had Native Americans in the Americas. So I say that to tell you that I know that there were other early civilizations, not only that were around at the same time as the Sumerians. I know that. I know that you had ancient China, you had ancient India. I mean, these are very, very old and ancient people. And even in the New World, in South Africa, you had civilizations in Peru that were ancient. But the Sumerians were different from any of those ancient civilizations because they were pretty advanced in their civilizations, and their civilizations led to the modern world. We can't really, even though we know that ancient Chinese were there, and the ancient Peruvians in South America, we know they were there, but we didn't really get anything from them, to advance on the modern world. From the Sumerians, we got, again, so much. We got the number one thing that we got from them was writing. And they had a very unique form of writing that we call cuneiform. And the Sumerians gave us that. But they gave us so much other stuff that's why we call their civilization the cradle of civilizations, even though there were, numerous other groups of people throughout the world at the same time. All right. Having said that, I want to talk about the discovery of the library in Nineveh. And the town of Nineveh, or the city of Nineveh, was the Assyrian capital. And the Assyrians, they come about late in the Bronze Age, where you're almost getting into the Iron Age, and so they're late on the scene. And the Assyrians, their capital again was Nineveh, and Nineveh was only known about in the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible for centuries before it was actually discovered that this is a real place that the Bible talks about, and then it was only excavated. Look here, it says it was only excavated in the 1840s, and in the 1840s, in 1849 actually, the library of Ashurbanipal was discovered, and we discovered all of these writings in cuneiform that talked about, the Sumerians. This is where we learned about the Akkadians. We didn't know anything about the Akkadians before 1850, when the library of Ashurbanipal was discovered. And I say that to say that, there's a lot that we haven't discovered. There's a lot that we still don't know. We have some cuneiform that we haven't even translated yet. So, and we've only known about this stuff for 200 years now. It's not a long time. We've only been able to translate the Sumerian language, for since the early part of the 20th century. So I'm saying this to say that there's still so much that we don't know, but we do know a lot, and we know a lot more than we knew 1,000 years ago, because we have discovered these writings and are able to translate them. I want to start with this clip. This is a clip. What is this? This is about the Ashurbanipal library that was discovered. Take a listen.
For centuries, the library was just merely a myth passed along by scholars, a treasure trove of knowledge that can't be found. Generations have gone by, the world has changed. Civilizations began to rise and fall. Civilizations like Great Britain began their conquest of the world to find every corner of the earth and claim it for themselves. And in 1849 AD, the British had an empire that spanned the world and an army of archaeologists that would go wherever they pleased. Austin Henry Layard, a renowned British archaeologist, was tasked with leading the British force across the ancient lands of Nineveh to see what remnants they could find. In 1849, he found the royal palace of Sennacherib under rubble. When he found the first tablets in 1850, Austin exclaimed, "The chambers I am describing appear to have been a depository for such documents. To the height of a foot or more from the floor, they were entirely filled with them, some entire, but the greater part broken into fragments." Though Austin loved studying the Assyrians, he found the appeal of British politics and left Nineveh to pursue a political career. In his absence, he left his Ottoman assistant Hormuzd-Rassam in charge. He continued the dig and found numerous tablets, including the stories of Enula Elis, Adapta, and, of course, the Rassam cylinder. With the permission of the Ottoman Empire, Rassam took the tablets back to the controversial British Museum. Like the original looting of Babylon, Rassam carried the clay like a souvenir. He didn't bother to keep the tablets in any order or track where they were initially found, just like the ancient Assyrian soldiers who did the same in ancient Babylon many years ago. though many archaeologists now criticize Rassam for his lack of documentation, creating many questions that are still unknown to this day. These tablets were written in various Akkadian and cuneiform languages that are rarely spoken, and that only the most advanced and dedicated of people would have understood. That's when a young George Smith came on the scene. During the day, he had a monotonous job of being a banknote engraver, though whenever he had the chance, he ran to the British Museum reading whatever texts and tablets they had, becoming a self-taught cuneiform expert. The museum noticed his passion and finally hired him to achieve his dream job, to be an Assyrianologist. His task was to order and rejoin fragmented tablets into their original shape. Little did he know that one day, as he was sorting out the fragments, he discovered a story about a flood and the quest for immortality. Though a piece was missing tragically, the undeterred Smith still wanted to claim this discovery. After he gave a speech about his discovery in front of Prime Minister William Gladstone, he was sponsored to go to Nineveh and find the missing fragment. Within days of arriving, he found the missing parts, and it turns out to be the oldest extant work in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
So far, and that's the point that I want to make, and that's the whole reason that I'm going through this history and letting you know how we know so much about these people is because of a discovery that was made 200 years ago. And again, as they say in the clip, I mean, there's still so much we don't know. There's still some cuneiform that has not been translated yet. So when they say that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest literature known to man, I mean, so far it is. We'll see what else we discover because I just think that it's fascinating that we've only known about this for 200 years. But so far, and as far as we know today, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest piece of literature.
He was sponsored to go to Nineveh and find the missing fragment. Within days of arriving, he found the missing parts, and it turns out to be the oldest extant work in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh.
All right, so from there, I want you to listen to a little bit of this Dr. Maiano. I think he's an anthropologist, but he's going to go into a little bit of the history of the discovery of cuneiform and how it was translated.
For those of you who don't know, and as Lee indicated, cuneiform is a script. It's a way to write a language, but it's not a language itself. In fact, in ancient times, cuneiform was used to write a number of languages. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Hurrian, and others. After the Phoenician alphabet was invented, a system that was way more efficient and economic, cuneiform gradually was abandoned. And over the centuries, those who knew how to use it all died off. The decipherment of cuneiform began in the 19th century with the study of Persian inscriptions. The kings of the Achaemenid Empire liked to put cuneiform on their monuments. This had not been the practice of the earlier Mesopotamians, who used it primarily on clay tablets. The Persian monuments were largely accessible at the time and in pretty decent condition. Typical inscriptions were trilingual, written in 3 languages, and in that sense, Rosetta Stone-like. The first of these 3 languages was, like the others, in wedge-shaped writing, cuneiform, except that it was alphabetic, although some signs were logograms. Some 43 signs were employed. Decipherment of that was started largely by a German scholar by the name of Georg Friedrich Grotefund, who started the process by recognizing proper names in the text and typical royal expressions. He revealed his findings in 1802. His work was refined and expanded by others after him. One was a Danish scholar, Rasmus Rask, who in 1826 demonstrated that the language was related to Sanskrit. We classify it now as Old Persian. The second language on the inscriptions is New Elamite. It contained over 100 signs, and thus was determined to be syllabic rather than alphabetic. That is, each sign represents a syllable instead of a letter. This form of writing and language still is largely obscure, and not as much work has been done on it as the other two. Okay, so we've got Old Persian, and we've got New Elamite. So now let's turn to the final language in these inscriptions. This is written in Mesopotamian cuneiform, the one I assume you're asking about. Probably the most notable early scholars that worked on the decipherment were Edward Hincks and Sir Henry Rawlinson, who separately worked on all three scripts. In fact, although each was helped by the work of the other, they appear to have been somewhat competitive. Sometimes you'll hear that the Behistun inscription was the Rosetta Stone for the decipherment of Mesopotamian cuneiform, which was used by Rawlinson to work it out. But it's not really true. Rawlinson concentrated on the trilingual inscriptions at Mount Elwand, near Hamadan, which he copied in 1835. Later, he will also use the Behistun inscription, but it wasn't really the key that unlocked everything.
Notice how this is
Many
all
inscriptions
taking
were
place in the 19th
Plus,
century.
Rawlinson,
In the early to mid 19th century is when this is taking place, just 200 years ago.
Tends to get most of the credit, while Hincks often gets forgotten. They both noted that the third script in these trilingual inscriptions had far more signs than even the New Elamite script, and they each concluded that it must be syllabic in nature, each sign representing a syllable. In 1846, they both published papers making this known, not knowing that the other had discovered it too. Hincks announced that he had determined the language to be similar to known Semitic languages, and that it was related to the cuneiform found on the many tablets that had been unearthed in Mesopotamia. It was the language of the Assyrians and Babylonians, which we now call Akkadian. At first, the only way that the sounds of cuneiform signs could be ascertained was by looking at the way known proper names were written. Hincks was able to find the name Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, written in many inscriptions. He also identified the first word that wasn't a proper name, the first person pronoun Anaku. Hincks figured out that a sign representing a consonant and a vowel could be followed by a sign representing a vowel and a consonant to create a single syllable of a consonant-vowel-consonant. He also was able to work out correspondences between two ways of writing a sign, which he called cursive and lapidary. Nevertheless, the extreme variety of the signs and peculiar features of the writing system, including an evolution in practice, made the script very difficult to decipher, and the works continued after Hincks and Rawlinson to the end of the 19th century through the discoveries of scholars like Friedrich Delitzsch, Benno Landsberger, and Wolfram von Soden. But what about Sumerian?
So the question he asks now, so what about Sumerian? All of that he's talking about from the middle part of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, all of the work that these men did was done to decipher Akkadian. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the Akkadian language, which I told you in the last podcast that we don't know where the Sumerian people came from because their language was completely unique, and we don't know. We can't chart where their language came from because their language is not Semitic. The Akkadian language is Semitic, and so that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about the Akkadian language when we first started to translate the cuneiform, that it was translated from the Old Persian, from the Elamite, from those three different languages. So we understand those languages, and then the Akkadian, which the Babylonians used and the Assyrians use, which is a Semitic language. But he's asking now, but what about Sumerian? Take a listen.
But what about Sumerian? Once the basics of the cuneiform system were worked out, it became possible for scholars to tackle also other languages that use the system. As early as 1849, Hincks had argued that the inventors of the cuneiform script could not have been the speakers of Akkadian or any Semitic language, because, as he said, no Semitic people could have invented a system of writing so uncongenial to their language. A heated controversy took place after Hincks' death between a scholar named Joseph Halevi, who argued that the Sumerian language and people didn't exist, and a scholar named Jules Oppert, who did. Various scholars took sides. It wasn't until the 20th century that Sumerian was finally understood to be a different language. Previously, they thought it was just a special way of noting Akkadian. But the strange character of the Sumerian language and the fact that there was no known language related to Sumerian made it very difficult to work out. There was no Rosetta Stone for this undertaking. What helped scholars to decipher it was the collection of grammatical lists and vocabularies that priests of Mesopotamia had made of the language. They had largely done this in later periods when Sumerian was no longer spoken, and they wanted to preserve knowledge of it. Scholars involved in the decipherment of the Sumerian language were the aforementioned Friedrich Delitzsch, François Thoreau-D'Angin, Arnaud Poubel, Anton Diemel, and Adam Falkenstein. Today, we can read Sumerian quite well. I hope that answers your question sufficiently.
So we've only been able to read Sumerian for the past 100 years. And then from being able to read Sumerian, we discovered things like the Sumerian king list. Let's see here, let me show you this. So we got the Sumerian king list, so we were able to read that, and we were able to go through, and it's got listed once the kings came about, because as I told you, the early society in Sumeria, they did not have kings, that their society was structured like this. Show you guys real quick. This pyramid here is a great representation. What's going on here? Of the structure of their society. So you can't see it that great there, but at the very top of the pyramid is the high priest. The high priest is the top of the pyramid in early Sumerian culture. Come on. Let me show you this thing. Come on. So you can see it there. So you got the high priest and the nobles at the top. Again, they had a democratic system where you would vote for the council of nobles, but the priest was at the top of the hierarchy. And then you had the managerial class, the middle class of officials, scribes, because they, created writing and could use writing, then being a scribe became very important. And literacy and learning how to read and write cuneiform, it was a way to, they didn't really have upward mobility. If you were a scribe, then, your children would most likely be scribes. But the difference in the caste system were based on education. The people who could read and write were more likely to be higher on the caste than people like craftsmen at the bottom here, servants, slaves, laborers, peasants, and there were more of these people. There were more craftsmen, servants, laborers, slaves. There were more of them than you had nobles, priests, and even a middle class. So keeping this bottom of the caste, keeping them happy so they don't revolt against the high priest and the nobles was very important. And that's why I'm talking about all of this and why I want to explain this to you, because the way that they manage their society, it has a lot of similarities in the way that the oligarchy and the elite manage our society today, with the high priest and the nobles using the managerial middle class as a buffer between the bottom class, and then also using psychological warfare and psychological tricks to keep the lower classes, to appease them so they don't revolt and disrupt the whole hierarchy. So this was the system in early Mesopotamia. But then when the kings came about, and you started to have kings, and we know exactly when the first kings came about because we have the Sumerian king list, and we're able to read the Sumerian king list, and we know when the first kings came on the scene. But and then when you had kings come on the scene, then you had the king and the priests, as I was telling you, in the upper class. They would share power, both equally power. Sometimes they would kind of wrestle for power. That's the age-old story. But the king and the priest, they work together again, and they work together to make sure that the hierarchy stayed in place, and that the majority of, because there was more people down here, there was more slaves, there was more commoners, and to make sure that they don't revolt against the king and the priests. It's a very tactful and elaborate little game that they played back then that is still being played on us today. So let's get into talking a little bit about the structure of the society in Sumeria. And remember, what I'm telling you is that the way that the society was structured in Sumeria is the way that the Akkadians structured their society, the Babylonians after them, the Assyrians after them. So everything that I'm telling you about the Sumerians is going to be consistent when we talk about the Akkadians and Babylonians and move down the line. All right, so this is a little bit about the how the priest, just telling you how the priest had such an important position. And then also, I want you to notice in this clip why the cuneiform was invented, what the writing was invented for. It wasn't invented, to write epics and poems and to record history. It was written. They created cuneiform specifically to keep records because they had an elaborate tax system where they were taxing the people that were doing the work. Where are we at? These people were being taxed. So you had to keep track of their taxes and their inventory, because most of the taxes were paid with crops. They were a very agricultural society. So that's why the cuneiform was invented. And then they started to use it after it was used for this practical purpose, for purposes of recording history, writing epics, and other things like that. Take a listen to this clip.
But to understand how writing began, we have to travel back to ancient Sumer, where the first widespread use of writing started. Look around, what do you see? Yes, you see the potters and the merchants, you see streets and gardens, but what do you see looming over all of it? The temples. These temples play a huge part in why writing began, for you see, Sumer was the land of the world's first real cities. Not hundreds of people, or thousands of people, but tens of thousands grouped together. And these cities formed city-states, bound together by the veneration of a specific set of gods. The people mastered irrigation, and the cities grew. And as the cities grew, so too did the temples to the gods. But these massive, sprawling temple complexes didn't serve only as houses of worship. No, look close. Do you see the men bringing in the clay pitchers full of grain? These temples also served as enormous warehouses, repositories for the vast wealth of the city. In good times, donations and gifts would come flooding in, and in lean times, they would be distributed back out. This system created vast wealth for the priests, but it also ensured that cities of this size could function. But we're not concerned with that.
So the priest becomes a very important person in a society like this. I mean, he's the most important person. He had to manage, the people, the scribes that were keeping track of the taxes and grain as it was coming in. He was the Lord over all the grain. He distributed out. He took it in. He was the most powerful person, the priest in early Sumeria. And I think about, the televangelist, the mega church evangelist that is a multimillionaire, and people are highly skeptical of him, and because he earns his money as a priest, but he lives a lavish lifestyle. This is what the priest would have been like in Mesopotamia as well. I mean, people are highly critical of the lavish riches of the Catholic Church and the Pope. Understand that all this stuff, even, the criticisms that the rich televangelists get today, all this stuff started with the priest in this hierarchy going back to Mesopotamia. Here's another clip that talks about how the priests would use these ceremonies to the gods, sacrifices to the god, to reinforce his authority. That, just let's watch this clip and you'll understand what I'm talking about.
Uruk was a walled city with an extensive canal system and several monumental temples called ziggurats. The priests of these temples initially had all the power because they were able to communicate directly with the gods, and that was a useful talent because Mesopotamian gods were moody and frankly pretty mean. Like, according to Gilgamesh, they once got mad at us because we were making too much noise while they were trying to sleep, so they decided to destroy all of humanity with a flood. The Tigris and Euphrates are decent as rivers go, but Mesopotamia is no Indus Valley with its on-schedule flooding and easy irrigation. A lot of slave labor was needed to make the Tigris and Euphrates useful for irrigation. They're also difficult to navigate and flood unpredictably and violently. Violent, unpredictable, and difficult to navigate. Oh, Tigris and Euphrates, how you remind me of my college girlfriend. So I mean, given that the region tends to yo-yo between devastating flood and horrible drought, it follows that one would believe that the gods are kind of random and capricious, and that any priests who might be able to lead rituals that placate those gods would be very useful individuals. But about 1,000 years after the first temples, we find in cities like Uruk a rival structure begins to show up. The palace.
So the kings and the palaces show up about 1,000 years after the beginning of the Mesopotamian culture. And this is when the Akkadians come out of the mountains and start settling next to them in this area. So they live there with this system for 1,000 years before the kings started to challenge the power of the priest and share power with the priest. And but I wanted to focus. I wanted you to focus on what he's talking about how that's how the priests would keep the underclasses, the bottom of the caste, the slaves, the laborers, the artisans, even the middle class scribes and that class. The way that the priests would keep them loyal to him as the priest and wouldn't challenge his power is that he would convince them that he had the power to appease the gods and could stave off any of the weather events or floods or winds, or to make sure that we do a sacrifice that we have a good crop in the spring, or the most important sacrifice that all ancient cultures did was on the 25th of December during the winter solstice. The time that we celebrate Christmas is when they did the huge ceremony where the priest would convince the people that he was making the sun rise again in the annual solar new year. I mean, convincing these people that you had all of this power also kept the society and the order of the society in check, and it also kept the people afraid on the bottom caste, so they would do their job and not revolt and not rebel against the higher caste. Let's listen to this clip. This reinforces a little bit what we were just talking about.
For the longest time, scholars used to think that the ancient Sumerians were an autocratic, authoritarian society, not unlike the ancient cultures of Egypt, China, and Babylon. However, this was not the case, as we now know. The ancient Sumerians enjoyed their fair share of democracy, even if not for the entirety of their existence. Most governmental positions were elected, and a council made the necessary decisions regarding state matters. The need for a single ruler arose when the warfare between the city-states became increasingly common, as well as clashes with the barbaric tribes to the east and the west. The Ensi, a city-state ruler, acted merely as a governor in the early days. He was elected and used to represent the city's patron god.
So that's how the kings came about. So it started with the priest being the head official, and then you would vote for the council of nobles, and then they needed a strong man, governor, to handle problems that the priests couldn't handle. So they had the Ensi, and then the Ensi eventually becomes the king.
He was elected and used to represent the city's patron god. Ensi also acted as the head priest of the temple and belonged to the patron god of the city. Each temple used to have two chief administrators, namely the En and the Sangha. The En handled the priestly and divine duties and acted as a supervisor for the priests and priestesses of the temple, while the Sangha acted as the business end of the temple's affairs. The priests in ancient Sumer were part of the nobility. Due to their higher status, they were more educated and enjoyed a much better lifestyle than their contemporary citizens did. One had to come from a noble family and pass some grueling training to become a priest. Before the Ensi assumed control as the supreme ruler of their respective city-states, a bicameral assembly consisting of lower and upper houses deliberated to conclude important matters of the state. The upper house consisted of nobility and priestly classes, whereas the lower house consisted of commoners. The socio-economic structure of the Sumerians could be divided into four classes.
So this is after the era of the kings. Again, this is a little bit of, where's the one that, this is simplistic. This is basically a more, it breaks it down a little bit more: slaves, commoners, merchants, scribes, priest, king. But this only has kings, nobles, commoners, and slaves, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's just broken down a little bit more in that other chart. But this was the structure of their society. And again, the structure of their society was the structure of the Akkadian society, the Babylonian society, all the way through to the Assyrian. And they adopted, when the Akkadians came along, they adopted the Anunnaki gods. And they added more gods to the pantheon, but the basic structure of their theology was taken from the Sumerians. They adopted the Anunnaki gods in Akkadia, and then the Babylonians adopted the Anunnaki gods. And then the Assyrians adopted the Anunnaki gods. Again, they would take different gods in the pantheon, like the Babylonians made Marduk the head deity. In the Sumerian culture, the deity that was the most important would have been Enlil. So they would take different deities, and different deities would have more prominence, but the deities they came from Sumeria. They came from the Anunnaki and their pantheon of gods. So another important thing is the education factor. Even though they had writing and they, even later on in their culture, the Sumerian and Akkadian culture, it wasn't beneficial to them to have a educated population. It would have been, if you're talking about keeping the structure of the society in place, and the priest using his priestly duties to instill fear in the bottom classes, and to keep them in control by making them think that you control the gods and you control weather, it would have been very detrimental to them if the commoners and the slaves and even, the merchants who were illiterate and couldn't read, it would have been detrimental to the structure of their society if everybody was literate. So it was beneficial to the kings, the priests, the nobles, and the scribe class to make sure that the rest of the social structure remained illiterate. And this factor of their society, it mirrors what's going on in our society today. And there's so much relevance to our society today, and how the elites, the oligarchy that's controlling our society, that they have made a concerted effort to dumb down our society to maybe not, maybe you could be have a literate society, but and literacy means that you're able to read and write, but you don't know. We have a whole generation of young people coming up that don't know anything. They don't know anything. They've been completely dumbed down by this education system. It's not an education system. It's a socialization system. They don't have any intention on educating you when you go into their system. That's why you have a lot of parents now homeschooling and leaving the public education system, because they've realized that the system is there to keep you dumb. And I'm not joking either. I wanted to play this clip from George Carlin, and there's a little bit of profanity in it, but he basically says what I'm trying to tell you here. Take a listen.
But if you talk to one of them about this, if you isolate one of them, you sit them down rationally, you talk to them about the low IQs and the dumb behavior and the bad decisions, right away they start talking about education. That's the big answer to everything. Education. They say we need more money for education. We need more books, more teachers, more classrooms, more schools. We need more testing for the kids. You say to them, well, we've tried all of that, and the kids still can't pass the test. They say, don't you worry about that. We're going to lower the passing grades. And that's what they do in a lot of these schools now. They lower the passing grades so more kids can pass. More kids pass, the school looks good, everybody's happy, the IQ of the country slips another 2 or 3 points, and pretty soon all you'll need to get into college is a fucking pencil. Got a pencil? Get the fuck in there, it's physics. Then everyone wonders why 17 other countries graduate more scientists than we do. Education. Politicians know that word. They use it on you. Politicians have traditionally hidden behind 3 things: the flag, the Bible, and children. No child left behind. No child left behind. Oh, really? Well, it wasn't long ago you were talking about giving kids a head start. Head start, left behind. Someone's losing fucking ground here. But there's a reason. There's a reason. There's a reason for this. There's a reason education sucks, and it's the same reason that it will never, ever, ever be fixed. It's never going to get any better. Don't look for it. Be happy with what you got. Because the owners of this country don't want that. I'm talking about the real owners now. The big, the wealthy, the real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. They're irrelevant. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media news, all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that.
So that's exactly what the kings and the priests in Sumeria didn't want. They did not want a population of people at the bottom who were able to read, to write, to think critically, and that's how they maintained their power. I'm going to talk more about this in the next podcast. I don't know, man. I really want to get into that migration stuff. I'll get into the migration stuff, and then we'll talk about ziggurats at the end of the next podcast. But the ziggurats they're the stage. They built these ziggurats as a place where they would gather the people around, the masses of the underclass, the commoners, and the slaves. And this is where they would do their sacrifices. This is where they would do their theatrics. And it was all there to keep the people in check. This ziggurat was the part of the temple. This is the forerunner of the pyramids. We'll talk more about that when we get into the next podcast. Well, I hope I didn't bore you with this podcast, but I think that understanding the stuff that I'm trying to explain here, talking about this history, and not only this history of witchcraft, because you're going to understand when we start talking about this in the next podcast that witchcraft was the base structure of everything they did in their religion, but not only in their collective worship when they would sacrifice together. In their homes, they were participating privately in witchcraft. And I'm going to relate it to what we're going through today. I promise you. But I hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back on Monday with episode 182. Thank you. You guys have a great weekend.